as TMTC being the host, I should also mention one of the traditions that has developed over the years is for TMTC in this ecumenical community to host an event roughly once a year, where whether as a panel or an individual speaker, we would try to engage issues of common interest to a range of Christian groups. And this is, I think, an excellent example of it. When this book appeared last summer, for those of us who were aware of of the genesis of the project and its intended impact, it became clear that this would be an excellent focus, especially because the very issues that it tries to address are so often in our news, increasingly so. And so today we have gathered a panel of speakers, all from quite a range of professional institutions and organizations. And in general, we've come here to engage, reflect on this book, but actually look beyond the book as well and try to see how the conversation that was brought together in this book could be brought further. I'll say a word of regret, first of all, that you would have noted Lee Miracle as one of the panelists, and she has not yet arrived, and I'm not sure she might still come, but at this point we have 3 panelists. I'll say a fuller introduction at the end of my before we begin, but Reverend Mark MacDonald, Chris Sabas, and Jennifer Henry, and we also have Ellen Hayes, who will begin our discussion later on. And I'll just say a bit of biography of each as well. But first, I just wanted to say a couple more comments about this book. For those who don't know it, it has brought together a conversation between what is in the book called Settler and Indigenous Cultures. And of the 18 essays, each, whether it's written by an Indigenous or a settler perspective or author, the other perspective will introduce and then also it's kind of bookends the essay. So for each of them, you get a conversation in each chapter. And that was the structure that formed the book. When this book came out, there were several very positive reviews, and I just want to say a few words by Tom Harper, a name that probably many of you know. We used to teach here many years ago. He said, "By far this is the most timely, provocative, and insightful book I've read this summer." I assume Tom Harper reads a lot. It is destined to cause controversy because it confronts some of the most acute moral and social issues facing Canada today. If you care about the environment, if you're disturbed by current disclosures of cultural genocide and ethnic cleansing of our Native peoples by past government policies, if you want to understand how our Indigenous people think about that past, about their hopes for the future, and if you're prepared to face some shocking truths about all of this and more, this book is a must-read for you too. And we will have other people reflect on this, but just to give one salient off these remarks. I'll also mention that the book is divided into 4 sections, and we have not structured the event to deal with those 4 sections, but I'll just, by way of overview, say it begins with several essays on naming the colonial context, so looking into the past. And then the second section is unsettling theology. And this term, unsettling, we read the introductory essay, and it's really the theme that both brought the book together, but also aims to send us into an unsettling conversation, to unsettle ourselves in an ongoing way. The third section is the voice of challenge and protest. and then looking to the future, the fourth section, where to from here. So we've asked our panelists to reflect on this book. Each of them have had a copy of it. And the question that we've asked them to bring here, quite simply, is so how does this book move the conversation about settler and indigenous relations forward? Or, on the other hand, how does it not move those forward? So what can we do differently beyond this book? And then what are your further suggestions for how to do so? Each of the three panelists will have some time to talk, and then we'll break for a 10-minute musical interlude, and during that time you can take a washer break if you need, but after the music we'll return and have a response, and the panelists can engage each other, and then we'd invite everybody to continue this conversation. So just a few words, a few biographical words for the panelists who are here. The Right Reverend Mark MacDonald, and you can see this information on here, and of course the internet contains loads more information that I couldn't include, listing recent publications relative to this work, but Right Reverend Mark MacDonald became the Anglican Church's of Canada's first national Indigenous Anglican bishop in 2007. So we've invited him in this role to reflect on these issues. Chris Sabas is a writer, Peacemaker. She, in her work, she's also an attorney and is a worker with Christian Peacemaker teams, has been involved in really the boots on the ground engagements, actual physical clashes at some points, with the very issues that Buffalo Shout raises in communities in the East, or communities in various places in North America. So we look forward to her insight. Jennifer Henry is Executive Director of KAIROS. It's an ecumenical organization that brings together peace and justice work, which many of you probably know about. Also, 1 week ago, wrote a letter that perhaps you'll comment on too, a letter to the Toronto Star about a decision by the government to not, we'll probably say more about it. But, so after the panelists speak, and we have a break, the musical break will be brought to us by Mama D, Diane Lafortune, singer-songwriter and activist. Again, more information on here and online, and we'll get pleasure of hearing that as we reflect a little bit on what we've heard and prepare for more conversation. When we come back from that, Director of Toronto School of Theology and a former professor of mine, Dr. Alan Hayes, will prepare some questions, some comments that will get the discussion going, and from there we will move to the audience. So, with no further rambling, I'd like to turn it over to Right Reverend Mark MacDonald.
Thank you. I'd like to greet you all as my relatives, and which is the way our elders ask us to do that, and I'm glad to do that, particularly in this context. I like this book very much. In fact, I've recommended it to a lot of people, and I'm teaching a couple of courses this summer at various institutions, and it will be on my reading list. So I would like people to have a chance to read it. The thing that I like about it, well, I know a lot of the people who wrote in the book, and sometimes in most cases I was familiar with their arguments and ideas, and I like that very much. But the thing that I liked about it most was the way it was presented. And I think that one of the most profound differences between Western people and Indigenous people has to do with thought and perspective. Among Indigenous people, there is something that has been called four-directional thinking, and it is the idea that truth is like a mountain. It is very, very present. It is something that it is in your face, but it is also something that it would be absurd to say that you could describe comprehensively from one direction, which is the way that Western thought is often perceived by Indigenous thinkers. So that truth is approached from a number of different angles, and that habit of thought, which our elders do naturally and without as much explanation as I've just given, is sometimes unsettling for people. And so I was at a meeting of elders, and the meeting got pretty critical of white people. And it was bang, 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 one after another. And then finally, the oldest one there said, "You know, I really feel sorry for white people. They have to pay for their own funerals, you know." And there was a white guy there, and he just went, "What?" You know, he just thought that was absurd, and he wondered about the sanity of the woman, and he even suggested that, you know, gosh, you know, she's probably been to the residential schools and she has all this stuff, you know. And I said, no, it's just four-directional thinking. You know, she thought the thought had gone a little bit too far in one direction, and she had to give it a little tug back. And the only thing that she could think of is that white people had to pay for their own funeral. And I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was loving. I thought it was kind, you know. And I thought it was also kind of telling that the only thing that you could think of was that white people have to pay for their own funerals. But anyway, I think that is a way of understanding four-directional thought. And the way, if I've often witnessed Westerners go to an Indigenous church meeting, and the sermon will just seem like, what? And they won't realize that this person is walking around a text, walking around it and trying to see it from a number of different perspectives. I think that this makes it difficult to talk about things and to have a conversation about difficult issues. And that's why I think it's wonderful that what we're presented with here really is a four-directional text with poetry and pictures and ideas and contrary ideas, and all moving around together, but looking at something from a number of different perspectives. About 10 years ago, a group of us put out a book on liturgical enculturation, which is making Christian faith incarnate in Christian communities, Indigenous Christian communities. And we decided after a while that we couldn't just write an argument, that we had to give a series of pictures that would include quotes from Indigenous elders who weren't Christian. Because what we wanted to do was to give people a four-directional experience of the topic that we were giving. And we really felt that it was necessary to do the kind of thing that you see happening in this book here. And that is not to hit something head-on, but to walk around it. This is very different very different from relativizing truth. It means that truth is very present in our life and in creation. But it says that human beings also always have to be humble in the presence of truth and can never claim to have absolute knowledge about anything. And Algonquian languages, particularly Ojibwe, have a dubitative mode. That was the name that some European linguist came up with. And it really means that, like for instance, in Ojibwe, when you meet somebody, meet a group, you're supposed to say, Nindawe Maganai, which means you're my relatives in direct translation, but it's dubitative mode. It's like, you might be. It could be, I hope you are. Could be even that I'm praying that you are. See? And this is very difficult to understand. I read a grammar that was written by a Roman Catholic priest, and he said Ojibwe just love to use this mode, but don't you ever use it. He found that very offensive. He said this is a good example of the way they think. He was dripping with criticism. Navajos always, when they say something about something sacred, will always say "jinne," which means that's what they say. Kind of, that's what they tell me, right? And so when they started speaking about Jesus, they would say, "Jesus Christ is risen." That's what they tell me. And the missionary just came unhinged, you know. No, it happened, you know. And so you have a very different. There wasn't any doubt about what was being said. It was just that it was the kind of thing that should humble a human being, and shouldn't be said like we've got this thing pegged. We got it right down. So that's an important thing, and that this book, I think, communicates that, and communicates a very complex and difficult reality in a very good way. The last two questions I want to respond to in one way. I was at a conference a couple of years ago. I get invited to a lot of conferences and speak on a lot of panels, and it was about Indigenous ministries for the next 20 years. And they wanted us to talk about what did we see in the future for Indigenous ministry. And I said, I think the first thing that will happen in the next 20 years is that we'll get a new past. And they all looked at me, okay. And they have to be nice to me, but they're not being nice to me. But for most Western observers, and for a lot of Indigenous observers who've been trained in Western thought, Indigenous people are interesting if they haven't assimilated in any way, shape, or form, or have been able to preserve the fiction that they haven't assimilated in any way, shape, or form. You know, this is always a problem. I told some guy that I like the Beatles, and he said, "You listen to them?" Like, you know, we don't have any radios. You know, we don't watch TV. We don't know who Disney is. You know, so and as Martin Brokenleg said, it's as if you know, we present ourselves as people who were raised in a closet by our grandparents for 30 years, and then you know, jumped out immaculate with no exposure to Western culture at all. That's just not true. So there's the 5% that are interesting to Westerners on the side who have not assimilated or have kept the look of not assimilating. And then the 5% that are also interesting are the people who completely assimilate. The 90% in the middle are zeros without a rim. The rest of us are just kind of, you know, we don't live up to anybody's expectation. We don't, you know, we don't look Indian enough. We don't look Native enough. We don't look, what happens in that 90% is that they have made a very complex negotiation of a whole bunch of ideas as a strategy of survival in some of the most difficult, complex, and dangerous circumstances that human beings can live in. Not for 1 year, not for 10, not for 50, but for 400 plus years. And so this complex negotiation has produced some very amazing and wonderful things. It's produced a hymn-singing tradition that I like to talk about. It's produced forms of Christianity that were resistance to colonization rather than assimilation to colonization. It has, and these stories virtually never are told. They're not known. They're not. People, for the most part, haven't been interested. The missionary organizations that encountered these things probably firsthand saw these things as failures. They had no interest in seeing large numbers of indigenous people who continued to live a subsistence lifestyle. This was not what they were paid to do. And the anthropologists who were looking for pristine indigenous people didn't want people who smudged and sweated but also believed in Jesus. And don't get me on the environmentalists. You know. I was at an environmentalist con, and I often have to act as a translator back and forth. And so they were all excited, you know, oh, we have our elder Annie, she's going to get up and pray for us. You know, they were just expecting Black Elk Speaks, you know. And she got up, Hail Mary, full of grace. And they just went nuts. They were ready to, oh boy, they were upset. So this is the kind of world that we live in. It's crazy making, you know, because the 90% are pretty smart, pretty ingenious, pretty tricky, with a lot of humor, who have managed to preserve a connection to the old ways, and have found, oftentimes have found Christianity as a translation, like the software that allows them to speak in both worlds. And so, I think that when Steve writes this, writes the update, he'll probably have a chapter about that. Thank you.
Before Chris begins, there's a couple of people who need seats. So there's a few in here. You want to come to at the very front? You're welcome to settle in. Is the air temperature okay for me? Yeah. Well, in any case, we turn now to Chris Sabas of CPT.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm energized to see this turnout today and see many familiar faces. And I, too, know personally several of the essayists from the book, including Steve Heinrichs, who not only is with the Mennonite Church of Canada, but he is also reservist with CPT. So I couldn't put this book down. I literally read it in a 24-hour period. And hearing some of the remarks already in terms of being unsettled and being humbled, I certainly was. And I'm certainly humbled to be here today as part of this panel. And when the invitation was extended, we as a team talked about it in terms of what can we do to contribute to this discussion and to answer the questions that was presented to the panelists. So I want to pull from one of the chapters in the book. It's actually, I believe, the last essay, chapter 18, for those who have the book with them. And it's titled Dangerous Goods: 7 Reasons Creation Care Movements Must Advocate Reparations. And this is by Jennifer Harvey. And I'm just going to pull from one paragraph here before I continue. It is in a spirit of honoring such pain that I argue here that settler colonial Christian movements for environmental justice need to explicitly and unabashedly support Indigenous struggles for sovereignty and land rights in a posture of reparations. If we do not, we will advocate goods, quote, goods, that are in reality dangerous, and which perpetuate the very structures of oppression. So I sit here today as a representative of Christian Peacemaker teams, and our response and our effort to be a part of this continuing conversation when we fast forward later to the dialogue is we want to express a bit of what we do and ask the question, are we doing this? So when I say that, let me say briefly who we are, CPT. CPT, Christian Peacemaker teams. I think we just celebrated our 26th or 27th year. And we seek to build partnerships, to transform violence and oppression. We are a faith-based movement. We were born, so to speak, out of a call that was put to the Mennonite World Conference in 1984. And that call and challenge was to create an alternative to warfare. So now we are worldwide. We have members and supporters and regional groups across the globe. We're grassroots. We are supported primarily by individual donors. We currently do not take any type of government money. And I need to put a plug. There's a table in the back. Esther's looking at me. And you can see more of who we are. And of course, we would graciously accept donations. But we strive and we are committed to work and be in relationship that embody creative nonviolence and liberating love. Part of this is this concept of undoing oppressions. This is very important in our line of work. We recognize that violence is made possible through ideologies like racism and colonialism, which is all throughout this book. And even I, as an advocate and as a justice seeker, I was unsettled when I put this book down. This is what this book is about. However, we are a welcoming organization and we seek to be welcomed. In other words, we don't go to a community unless we are invited. We want to be useful. We currently have 4 long-term projects: Palestine and the occupied West Bank, Colombia, Iraqi Kurdistan, and the Aboriginal Justice Team here on Turtle Island. And that is the team I'm currently serving with. We have our mandate, the Aboriginal Justice Team, and our mandate is to undo colonialism. Let me read that to you in the spirit of continuing this discussion. CPT's Aboriginal Justice Team is mandated with undoing colonialism and supporting Indigenous communities seeking justice and defending their lands against corporate and government exploitation without community consent. CPT seeks to enlist the whole church in the work of undoing colonialism. Now, from our standpoint, when we seek to be advocates and when we seek in terms of education, when we talk about colonialism, we don't come at it as a means to say, well, we need to reverse the physical settlements. You know, everybody needs to go back to country A or point of origin. We approach it from a conversation as to an ism, like racism, sexism, heterosexism, colonialism. In other words, an identity-based oppression, which defines one group as inferior to another, and that the structures that are in place facilitate this or carry that on. So from our standpoint, the primary function of colonialism then is to justify limitless resource extraction, regardless of the rights and the needs of the people who are already living on the land. So we believe in undoing colonialism and walking a different path based on cooperation and mutual respect, or right relationships, which again, you will see referenced at length in the book. From our standpoint, it's more than spiritual. It isn't just spiritual, but it's relational. And it has immediate practical and physical consequences. And it's not just us going out and say, hey, you need to undo this colonialism. When I talked about our practice of undoing oppressions, we also look within, and we look within ourselves. And in spirit of being humble and recognizing that discussion, I can tell you we're actually in a conversation about our name, the Aboriginal Justice Team. Who do we think we are? And, you know, there's been a good, lively discussion, and in fact, I would be interested to hear some feedback regarding this, my fellow panelists. Is Aboriginal, is that continuing this concept, this idea, not a concept, but this practice of the oppression, this practice of the ism, this practice of colonialism? We've received some feedback already that, you know, we really need to think about this in terms of Aboriginal being the appropriate terminology. This is what I'm talking about. It's not just us going out in the world with capes and saving the day. It's looking within. The challenge from this book. We too have to look within in order to come about how do we live in right relationship, right? So, in terms of the Aboriginal Justice Team, officially we've been in existence for 5 years, but I can tell you, or 5 or 6 years now, but I can tell you CPT has been engaged in Indigenous advocacy for many years. And it came out of the need to have allies present in what we call land-based defense. For instance, we'll have presence at where there's projects that have been developed or passed without community consent, whether it be mining or logging or just most recently fracking. And I want to share a quote with you from one of our partners from the Grassy Narrows First Nation, which really highlights what I'm trying to get across today. This is from Roberta Kiesick. She is from the Grassy Narrows First Nation. Again, when I say First Nation, is that appropriate? You know, that could also continue this ideas of isms. You know, what is the appropriate, what is the more respectful way of terminology? But in any event, she's from Grassy Narrows. She's a grandmother and a trapper. This is what she said. Our culture is a land-based culture, and the destruction of the land is the destruction of our culture. So from our standpoint, when we do receive invites and when we do go out and seek to be partners and to seek to build these relationships, it is challenging. You know, when we talk about partnerships or relationships, that takes a lot of time. You know, you need to get to know one another. You need to build a foundation, you know, a concrete structure level foundation of respect and of trust. And it doesn't happen overnight. And the challenge from our standpoint at times, when you heard boots on the ground, sometimes we go and we're on site of a very intense, heated campaign. Again, whether it be against a logging campaign, you know, against a logging project or even a proposed fracking. And that presents challenges of its own. And there's missteps and there's misunderstandings. But our question is, when we read the book, and especially when we responded to the last chapter, are we serving the call in the way that we should? Because, you know, standing in solidarity with those who have been maliciously harmed and continue to be maliciously harmed by the heartless transgressions of the world, that's going to bring us into conflict with the way that things are, as they are. And you know that's okay, because if things remain as they are, that's unsettling.
Thank you.
I'm honored to be here on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas. I'm honored to be among these wise folks. I consider Bishop Mark one of my wisest friends, and he gets to correct all my heresies. And Chris is a colleague in the justice struggles, and I thank you both for the hosting of this time. I'm also honored to engage this book. I think it's an important book. I'm going to speak as a settler. My family came to Turtle Island in the early 1600s, and as a Christian, my roots are Anglican, but I serve ecumenically in KAIROS. My ancestors of both blood and faith were collaborators and protagonists in this terrible legacy of colonization and of residential schools. And I am a beneficiary, and as much as I express in my own life my own commitments, I can't take that culpability away. There are lots of different perspectives and tensions and challenges in this book, but I want to speak to it sort of holistically as one example of the dialogue that we desperately need. And so I have 5 affirmations that I would like to make, things in this text that I resonated with myself. The first affirmation is to say that the aspects of Christianity that provided the theological architecture for colonization were not and are not marginal within the Christian tradition. And to say it another way, the core concepts, central texts, foundational theologies are implicated. Whether we're talking about the dominion over piece, whether we're talking about the Great Commission, whether we're talking about I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. We're talking about core pieces of the Christian story. They're not rogue ideas. And because these concepts were appropriated to colonialism, because they were appropriated to serve the colonial interests, we have mammoth theological work to do, to acknowledge them, to deconstruct them, to reject them, to reinterpret them. And in my view, really, the integrity of Christianity is at stake in this task. My second affirmation is a related one. And this is one that I really would stake my faith on. I'm a Christian still because I believe this, that within the Christian tradition there are resources to help us, to assist us in this mammoth theological task. That there are theologies of repentance and lamentation and hope and restoration and justice. There are theologies that respond, I think, creatively and respectfully to the challenges of Indigenous wisdom. You can read some of those in this text, folks who lift up liberative Christian ideas, and they read those against, through, under, beside the colonizing concepts that I speak of in that first affirmation. What I would say in summary for this one is really that there are the resources in the tradition to help it redeem itself. And I would claim that these concepts around honoring creation and demanding justice and respecting the dignity of all are also core. My third affirmation is that what is required of settler Christians right now is repentance and contrition. The word contrite, I'm very interested to find that the word contrite in Hebrew comes from the word for crushed. So if we are to have contrite hearts, it means that we're to have broken hearts or crushed hearts. I think that our hearts are crushed not only for the betrayal of other human beings, not only for our betrayal of creation in all its diversity, but because what happened was an offense against God. And I'm not sure that our apologies consistently get at this notion that the colonizing mission violated God. My fourth affirmation is that my sense that what's required in the world right now, and this comes through clearly in the book, this world that's on the brink of ecological collapse, are exactly the worldviews and the perspectives that as settlers we endeavored to eliminate. So the notions of an inclusive circle, the seventh generation, equality, all my relations. The recovery of Indigenous worldviews and culture is absolutely essential, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all of us, and for, in fact, the earth itself. If we're going to begin to work towards some kind of balance, if we're going to walk away from the brink of ecological disaster. And finally, I would say that the action of decolonization, of truth and reconciliation, of recovery, the work that seems in some ways to be about the past, requires direct and urgent attention to the injustices of the now. There's no way to decolonization that goes around the reality of missing and murdered Indigenous women, that goes around boil water advisories, inequities in schooling for First Nations children, and on and on. This means respecting free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples for development projects that occur on their traditional territories. It means implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It means respecting self-determination. My sense is that justice making in the now is not an optional activity for post-apology churches. It's not an optional activity for any church that seeks to be in solidarity. And it's going to take us into terrain that is not necessarily polite, neat, or risk-free. It's messy. It's going to be messy. We might have to take sides to stand with Indigenous peoples in compelling ways if we want to reclaim our own integrity, and I think we want to speak to the gospel that we say we serve. Now, Walter Brueggemann on the back, if you look, calls this a courageous and, a courageous and urgent book. And I'm not one to disagree with Walter Brueggemann. but I would call it that too. But I also would recognize a very large gap between the words on these pages and the average Mennonite settler church, the average Anglican church, the average non-Indigenous Canadian. So I think what we really need is the courage and urgency to bring this conversation right into the heart of our communities, where it is going to rattle settler ancestry and identity. We're going to have to unpack privileges and narratives of superiority. And it's going to be a messy and unsettling conversation, but one we need to have desperately. My sense is we're really at a KAIROS moment when there are impossibly hopeful things happening. And at the same time, there is entrenched despair. And in fact, it's that impossible hope that makes that despair even more difficult, those places of entrenched racism. But we, I think, need to harness the hope to help unsettle the places that are far too settled. So a few things just to close. Can this kind of conversation at TST, and it's wonderful that it's happening, can this kind of conversation push and nudge theological colleges to require graduating students to have a full course around Indigenous spirituality or Indigenous justice? Can we raise the bar in terms of what we expect of folks graduating into leadership because of our mission history as Canadian Christians? Can the local churches, and there are some who have tried to understand their treaty context, their traditional territory that they are on, who've tried to forge relationships and make commitments in justice, can they nudge and challenge those, evangelize those churches that are very far away from that? Can the winds of self-determination continue to blow through our churches? Can we start to create a reduction in the gap between Indigenous churches and non-Indigenous or settler churches in terms of what clergy are paid, or what the church looks like inside, or whether or not there's water and a sufficient kind of place to be and worship? And can the processes of truth and reconciliation and I don't know more continue to challenge us to Indigenous justice and help us in those places where people know all the stereotypes of Indigenous peoples, but they don't know any? I wonder sometimes whether as settler communities and churches we can change enough. And I wonder if we can stay responsive to Indigenous leadership. And most of all, I guess I continue to be shocked and humbled that the hand of welcome or friendship is still extended. But I put my faith in my daughter, who might, I feel, live to see the signs of reconciliation that we can only just begin to imagine. And so I think of my work and our work of this generation as about repentance and justice and healing and reparation and remembering the treaties. And her work, I hope, will be about that new covenant, that unbreakable covenant, the one that's going to be written on all our hearts, that will, I think, better reflect what the elders' original vision was for us when we met each other on the shores.
Thank you to each of you for those words. As I mentioned at the outset, one of our panelists has not arrived. We will have a slightly looser time frame. We had actually tried maybe to pack too much in, so this might feel a bit more comfortable. I said that we would have a musical interlude, and just to sort of wrap up this section, I have a couple of quotes from the book, from the introduction, from Steve Heinrichs, that I think will maybe bring together some of these thoughts. On page 18, he, after mentioning the ecological crisis and various other motivations that stand or that underlie the settler Indigenous relationship or crisis, he writes, there's a real emergency in our world on a scale that humanity has never seen before. It's bigger than the biggest of wars. The planet is in the process of being killed, a geocide. And Indigenous cultures and creatures are taking the heaviest death blows. And here's the key. It's not the Indigenous that are responsible for sabotaging the only ark we have. It is, by and large, colonial settler civilization. A couple pages later, there is a settler problem, and we need desperately to do something to undo it, because both the time is near, and for far too many, it's already long gone. My hope for this book, he writes, is that a few souls within the dominant system might be unsettled by its contents and stirred to join those who've been working at this problem for years in a tradition that goes back centuries. It's an earnest ambition. So, with a few of those words to tie things together, I want to turn over to Mama Dee, who I think could also be part of this panel. I know for sure after she sings, she will have thoughts and words to contribute, but now we'd like to hear music.
Shut up and sing.
So if anybody needs a washroom or restroom, you turn right out of here and down the hall. We'll have one song or two.
Two, and then at the end I'll do something. There's so much Teasers, T-I-S-A-R-S. Turtle Island Settler Atonement and Reparation Societies. And the other thing I want to talk about, just one really briefly, is around what you said, and about tokenism, and about competing narratives. They're not competing, actually. One narrative wants to totally obliterate the other narrative. There's nothing competitive about them. Tokenism means, and it's not about pride, it means a willingness to accept disrespect. Basically let somebody chew in your dignity and spit it back in your face. And the significance of that is how often we are forced to bite our tongues, count to 10, and then figure out a way, how am I going to deal with this person? How am I going to deal with this because I want to have a relationship with this person because they're somewhat open? Well, music is one of the ways. And the other way is, I'm doing a decolonization workshop on the second, this is just another thing I should be announcing, but you'll get it all in your mail. Decolonizing the Heart. The Saturday before Mother's Day at Bates the Tune. I wrote this song 30 years ago. The muddy beach, a burning tree, the boats have landed. But the line from the ship to the shores in our command now. To the healers, believers, the lovers, the dreamers before us. Your words are strong, they carried us on. What do we make of this? You have smiled as you recounted your and wait. For all your trouble, for all the grief, for all your bloody trails. Till now your breath like a vicious storm blows itself across the scale. And on the evidence you're implicated, and on the evidence, oh, we all pay the price. And on the evidence you've been found guilty, and on the evidence it is time for reparation. The next song I'm going to do, and I'm hoping that maybe CBT will invite me to participate in that Mennonite thing that's happening in Winnipeg in the end of July, because I'm going to be there anyway, because I'm doing I had a paper accepted at the International Congress of Genocide Scholars. It's going to be held at the University of Manitoba, and I'm going to be doing a keynote panel on the allegories of colonialism and the idea of narratives. I mean, we all need to tell stories. That's how human beings, it's inherent. We have to tell stories that make sense. And I found this great book. Art is so important. Muhammad Hanif wrote this book called The Temple of Alice Baki. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. Anyway, he's got this one line in it that summarized years and years of studies of anthropology, symbolic anthropology and psycholinguistics. This person, Alice, I have to share this with you because it's so brilliant. This person, Alice, it's a third person narrative, and somebody's questioning her faith, and the author says, "Oh, Alice knew what faith was. Faith is our fear of death clothed in a party dress." Whew. Okay, so I didn't have to study those 6 years of anthropology. There it is. So this next song is a song of humility. Songbird in a golden cage, she prefers the blue. Lord, I'll crave the echo of her song. Harm could she do? She shall be my prisoner lifelong. A songbird wants her freedom. Now don't you think I know? But I can't find it in my heart to let my songbird go. I just can't let her go. Oh Lord, when your jeweler's eye peers into my soul, Lord, I'm overcome with shame. Take me, Lord, and purify. Give me with a word. Lord, I beg a gift I dare flame. My songbird wants her freedom. Now don't you think I know? But I can't find it in myself to let my songbird go. I just can't let her go.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
I have CDs for sale.
As it was mentioned, the collection itself is a combination of quite varied literary genre, everything from systematic to poetic to memoir to comic book, cartoon at one point. So we couldn't actually create an event that portrayed that, but we could invite Mamadi to give this a bit of an artistic shift. But now we want to focus back, and for that we have Dr. Alan Hayes, Director of TST, to start off as an adjunct provocateur.
Stand so you can see and hear me. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I've really enjoyed this, hearing this. A lot of interesting ideas. I've read the book too, but I don't know, living voice is even better than written words sometimes. So this has been good. Now, I haven't heard this, what people have had to say earlier than you have, so I'm just going to give some initial kind of responses, and I don't actually even know if this is necessary, because you probably already have things you want to ask about or say. But anyway, I've got one or two things maybe on each of the three folks that I've heard and what they've had to say. So from Mark, the Four Directions, and I think this is really true. This is a book that does not have a single point to make at looking at things from a whole bunch of different points of view. And that's one of the unsettling things about it in a way, although also one of the good things about it. So you've got someone like Thompson Highway saying, look at the Bible, it is really reinforcing colonialism and it is a repressive force. And you've got Dave Dewart saying, look at the Bible, it's going to liberate us of all this colonialism and all this repression. And you've got Tim Tinker saying, the Indigenous worldview is over here, and that's one thing, and it's kind of pro-nature, and then you've got the settler point of view over here, and that's just the opposite, and that's kind of, exploiting nature. And then you've got Will Ron saying, look at the real world here, Bob Ray, the settler, is trying to stop the mining industries from extracting all these resources, and Owen Mercury over here is the Assembly of First Nations guy who's the big spokesperson for extracting resources. So there's different points of view all there. Now you wind up and you finish the book and you say, ooh, where am I? So I think Jennifer's right. The way you process that is by having discussions like this or discussions in our churches. In a way, it's a good resource to have a book with a lot of different points of view, because people read it and they don't think someone's just trying to, make them think a particular thing. They're actually the book's trying to make you think about a whole bunch of different things. So that's good. The other thing I like about what Mark said, I always like everything Mark says. One particular thing, I'm just going to name one or two, is that we need a new history. And so a lot of the history we have of First Nations people and Aboriginal people is not written by themselves. It's not told by them, or at least we don't get into high school curricula or university curricula very much. So at first it was kind of the missionary history. The history of Aboriginal people was the history of their being kind of evangelized, and then it became, now it's kind of a political history, I guess. It's a history of legislations and amendments and Indian regulations and all that kind of stuff. But we are now getting into the world, and I guess this is what post-colonial discourse is about, in which we try to tell the story from the point of view of First Nations folk themselves. And doctoral student here, Aaron Mix-Ross, who's going to do exactly that in his doctoral thesis. And so it becomes kind of self-identified, and you become people with history. So a lot of, a danger in some of the articles in the book is that they tend to take this kind of essentialist point of view that to be Indigenous is to conform to the following kind of criteria about worldview and relation to nature and ceremony, and to be settlers to conform to this kind of point of view and so on. And the fact is there's a history there, there's creativity, there's kind of adaptation. I think Mark said that when he talked about the 90% of people who've got to kind of negotiate between cultures. My daughter's roommate is status Indian, Oneida Tens First Nations, but her father's non-native. Now her father's not part of her life, but mind you, and she grew up in London, and she goes to university, and she's bicultural. She's not assimilated, she's not segregated, she's bicultural, and that's like thousands of people. So having to be able to tell that history, I think, is in fact part of the solution. A couple of things that I liked about what Chris had to say was kind of the focus on how to undo oppression. There are items, chapters in this book where there's an awful lot on the problems and a lot on the sins to be expiated and a lot of the injustices to be repaired. But when you look for solutions, sometimes it's, kind of wind up, Jennifer Harvey kind of winds up by saying, I'm aware that my argument might generate moral paralysis and despair. Yeah, actually, some of that. Because the problems are so big and they're all related to everything else, And I mean, basically, she says you can't really kind of start to do this until you get rid of private property. Well, if people bring clean water and if kids are being kidnapped, you kind of want to deal with that before you deal with getting rid of private property. So how do we undo oppression, not just on a kind of a leisurely timeline, but, like now? How do you do that? So I think that's a good question to ask. And the words. So Chris talked about even words like Aboriginal and First Nation. They tend to kind of box people, and they set up stereotypes and caricatures, and she named that, and I think that's true. How you get out of words, I don't know. But, so you may know there's Michael Grey Eyes, who's a native dancer, and he's an example of what you might call hybridity, right? He's spirituality and aesthetics are native, but he's also a graduate of the National Ballet School, and he talks about going to do native dance at an event in Norway, and somebody comes up to him afterwards and says, I like that dance, but next time could you bring something Indian? And he kind of knows what this guy means. He means, well, I thought you were going to kind of put on a certain kind of costume and do a certain kind of war dance or something like that, and instead it's, it's creative, and I don't want that. I want something that reinforces my idea of what you should be and what you should do. And I think artists especially, native artists especially, had that problem. I'm seeing a nod over from Mama D here. People will say, oh, it's very nice because I'm not that native. Well, of course it is. So the box problem is a problem. A couple of things I like about what Jennifer said is to remind us that Indigenous spirituality is a resource and for the issues that we're talking about. And more and more I kind of really realize that that's true. Now the danger with, again, words, right? So the danger with the word spirituality is that if you think of that from a kind of a modern Christian point of view, maybe not a traditional Christian, but a modern Christian point of view, spirituality means, the way you pray and the way you go to church and a certain set of values and discipleship. What we're really talking about by spirituality is a whole way of life. And that's not something that you can kind of describe or propositionalize. I think it's something you have to experience and engage with. So it definitely is a resource, but to get at that resource is one of the things that we need to grapple with. And then, maybe I've already mentioned this, I guess, in the others, but what Jennifer says about identifying the issues, the urgent issues that need to be addressed. That would be, if I were bringing this into a church community, which I hope I can do, that would be what I would want to be kind of a bottom line. I think that's what I would want people to have as a kind of final focus. What are the issues? And the final focus is how do we address it, not just what issues need addressing, but how do we address it.
Thanks very much. So now we move into the last, until 6:30, we have time first for the panel to either respond to Alan's comments or to anything you'd like to comment on that you've heard so far. So a brief moment for that, and then we return to an open discussion that everybody can participate in. Would anybody like to begin? Jennifer?
What?
Age before beauty.
Well, I like what everyone said, and I think that everything, the song, everything was very complimentary. It was four-directional. So I think that I'm looking forward to questions. I think, well, yeah, one thing. I recently wrote a paper with Lori Ransom, who's works for the TRC. She's a Presbyterian, and it was on repentance. And the point of our argument was that the church, which says it's all about reconciliation, when the TRC chair, Justin Sinclair, said, so what does reconciliation look like? The churches all go, I don't know. So what this reveals about us is that we're very, very good at individual repentance, and we don't know how to do corporate repentance, and we don't know. I mean, so I think that the way that the churches have, and I think it's directly related to what was said after, in that. The churches have acted, in terms of how institutions in our society address corporate wrongdoing, they have acted courageously, they have acted with resolve, and they're commendable as institutions in that sense. But boy, it leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to Christian repentance. And so, and I think the deeper worry in my heart about that is that this was done to people who they said were brothers and sisters. And reading a public apology, when I heard a brother or sister, reading a public apology doesn't really put it. So I think that there's a lot to be learned. I think that understanding systemic evil and understanding corporate repentance is something that the Canadian church could meditate upon for a long time, I think. And I think that it's related to these things, and perhaps why the church is from my point of view, lukewarm about following up on its commitments on these things. I mean, anytime I say that, I get, we're doing this, we're doing that, to me, if I heard someone I love, if I heard a relative, I don't list all the things I'm doing for them as a way of showing that I'm sincere. So So I think that's part of the secret of why we don't find the kind of commitment and fire that you would expect on these issues.
Thank you. Chris or Jennifer, to you.
Maybe just to say that there is still not the kind of non-Indigenous engagement in the truth and reconciliation process that there could be, and we are now facing the last national event and looking towards the closure of the process, at least in a formal sense. I have a friend, a progressive lawyer, environmental lawyer, served with many progressive causes, and when I said I was going to the Truth and Reconciliation at one of the national events, she said, "What's that?" And this is not a surprising response. In fact, that is the response of many non-Indigenous Canadians. The first is they don't know what it is. The second is if they do understand what it is, they think it's not for them. As in, this is a Indigenous conversation and a historical conversation. And therefore, in terms of being a present non-Indigenous person, it doesn't affect me. And if they take a step further and think, well, maybe it has something to do with me, I think they make the mistaken perspective that it's actually hurtful to go, which has been a hard thing to get to people to understand, that every story needs listeners, and that there needs to be people in live streaming in the rooms listening to this process. So, I mean, the work that I think we need to be committed to is helping people to understand that the process of truth and reconciliation, the complex and long process of it, that will not end with the process of the TRC Commission, is a process for all Canadians, and that it's not fundamentally about the past. It's about understanding the past so that there can actually be a different present and a different future. And I think that those two pieces are all of our responsibilities to try to help our neighbors across the fence, understand. And that if people don't get an opportunity, I think, to find themselves in this story, I think that they will look back on a loss for themselves. I believe that. Because it's about recreating a national story. Our story was about injustice, our nationhood, our creation of nationhood in that sense, and we need to recreate it in something else.
Yeah, I just want to say that's part of the challenge is recreating the narrative. I too can affirm what we just heard. So from CPT's perspective, because we are faith-based, we seek to challenge the church, whoever the church may be. So many times too, we get these responses of, well, that was in the past, or what are you talking about? Or we're doing all these things, we're giving donations, we're giving money, we turn the lights off when we walk out of the room. And so it can be very easy to get to the point at the end of chapter 18 of going into that despair mode in terms of, well, what are we doing? So I just wanted to affirm that the challenge is that we all have stories to share. We need to change the narrative because we're not talking about the past or even the most recent past. It's continuing. It's the present.
Just very quickly, I think that this is a very different perspective from an Indigenous perspective. In the Indigenous perspective, the dispossession of the land, which is at the heart of colonial oppression, is ongoing and accelerating. Whereas for most Canadians, even sympathetic Canadians, the dispossession is a historical event that they feel bad about. And I think that's very hard. Those two perspectives are very difficult. So, and it's kind of like, if you have a bottle of Pepsi with cyanide in it and a bottle of cyanide with the skull and crossbone on it, which will kill you deader? Well, they both will kill you, but the Pepsi is a lot more dangerous than the cyanide because at least you see it labeled. And the situation that we live in now is that Custer isn't chasing you anywhere, but a lot of other things are that don't look so nasty up front, but will destroy the relationship with the land just as effectively as that one. So,
Thank you for all these comments. Let's keep it rolling. Anyone clarification or questions? We'll start with
Theologically, how do we deal with the concept of the other? This has always been the barrier, whether it was going from a white society to other colors, or from, I grew up in an environment where the Catholics were the others and the majority of people were the Protestants, and that was a huge effort for me to overcome as a child growing up. And it's been most recent that I've had to confront the same question in dealing with Aboriginal people. I've come to love many Aboriginal people, but they don't want to be considered the other. They want to be considered who they are. And theologically, I think that's a challenge for Christians.
do you have a direct question or?
That's Mark MacDonald.
And I should have asked if you'd be willing to state, you don't need to, but if you're willing to state who you are.
My name is John Gilbart. I go to Humbercrest United Church, and I attend as many functions of this sort as I can fit into the schedule.
I think the rabbis said that the glory of God hovers over the bed of the sick. And Jesus, I think, in Matthew 25 expanded that image, that the glory of God hovers over the sick, the naked, the one in prison, and so on and so forth. I mean, and to me, God has planted a particle of my essential humanity in the other. And to me, Christian faith is nothing if it isn't a recognition of the radical community that God has created in us, and which I would say as a Christian was revealed in Christ's life, death, and resurrection. So I think the difference is, God obviously didn't want to make us one by obliterating our difference, but recognizing that there is really a part of me in you and a part of you in me, and the way I think Jesus taught it, I think it's read by most people as, well, be nice to people who are nasty, but I think that what he's saying is that I've taken a part of you and I've hidden it in your worst enemy.
Yours to discover.
Yes, and you have to find it, But I think that I think also that the other is an illusion, there was a Navajo elder once, they asked him if he did a lot of ceremonies, healing ceremonies. He said, no, I don't have to. I live as a relative with everybody. Meaning that was what creates health and goodness. So I think that's a Christian insight, but I think it's an indigenous insight that this relationality is the thumbprint of God in us, and got to discover that.
I wonder, Chris, does this connect with the issue of language that you're talking about and naming? Or if you want to make a further comment, otherness.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, yes, to answer your question, it does. And actually, what jumped out at me was touching the humanity aspect. That's a very integral part of our work. Especially when you talk about boots on the ground. With our most recent campaign, we really reached out to obviously not only people and organizers within the campaign, but what we consider the powers and principalities, whether it be government officials or the police force. And to hear it in terms of taking the piece of your humanity and being put in your worst enemy, yeah, that's what jumped out at me, and that's the challenge. It's right. It's more than just responding with love and not hating in return, but to go into further relationship with that person, regardless of who they may be.
Yeah, Philip?
In praise of this book, as well as having a diversity of 18 authors, it also has an opening and a response on each one of the chapters, and so you have a kind of a perspective, a second thought repeated on it. So it's a wonderful book. I also couldn't put it down. I had to read it pretty well nonstop. One thing that made me uncomfortable in the book, and I've only attended a few discussions on relationships between, let's call them settlers and Indigenous people, is the polarization, the kind of racist terms such as white versus Indigenous makes me uncomfortable, because I think, in fact, it's more complicated than that. It's not black and white. It's not one or the other entirely. I think it might be helpful to move the discussion a little bit more towards the area of collectivism versus individualism. There's quite a spectrum of, European people tend to be Protestant, especially European people tend to be more individualistic, I think, as compared to Indigenous people who might think more collectively. I think it's okay to have this diversity. I'm a Mennonite. I'm a member of a Mennonite church here in town, and we have relatives who are called Old Order Mennonites, and we can get along with it. It's okay to have people that are quite different and working together. In terms of the paralysis that has been mentioned here, I think when you're running a marathon and you're finished with the first mile, you're not going to be thinking about, well, what's it going to be like when I get to the end? I'm going to have all this, I'm going to get sustenance, this kind of thing. Well, you're never going to finish a marathon if you focus too much on the final outcome. And if we try and think, well, we've got to fix this whole thing, we've got to have solutions immediately for every problem. No, what we have to do is think about the place we're at and the direction we're taking, but we don't have to fix everything at one time. I think that reparations have to come before reconciliation. I think that's brought out in this book. And one possibility for reparation that could be made, I grew up on Six Nation land in Waterloo, and I'm thinking that there is a fair amount of government land that's within 6 miles of the Grand River. For example, the conservation areas, parks, that kind of thing. Why don't we lobby for a partnership between government and Six Nations on those particular lands, and see if we can make some progress that way.
That comes out of one of the essays. Derek Suderman, who happens to be my brother-in-law, was addressing that question, and so I'll pass it on to him. He's on sabbatical right now, so couldn't be here, but I myself was raised in that area too, and Alan, did you?
Yeah, just briefly, I agree with that, what you said, but on the last point, sorry, the last point, I forgot the last point. Yeah, you can't address everything all at once. And, like they say, all politics is local, and really all colonialism is local as well. And the kinds of answers that will work at Six Nations may not be the same that will work in inner city Toronto, may not be the same as what work in northern Saskatchewan and remote. So, doing things little by little is probably going to be more effective than trying to find an answer that's going to suit the entire global problem.
One thing that I wanted to bring up at the very end, but since we're talking about the practical impact and practical solutions, this, to some degree, is Steve Heinrich's part 2 of this. Who has seen this before? Okay, I don't know, it's only been out a month-ish?
December, the end of
December, okay, so those 3 months went by quickly for me. So Paths for Peacemaking is available for free on the internet. And what Steve Heinrichs, the editor of Buffalo Shout, did here was to present in what I think is at sometimes funny and witty and just, yeah, a delight to read. Various practical things that people can do to engage. So when we get to the moral paralysis, this, being 8 pages or so, it really is an amazing guide. We have 20 of them here for sale for $2, but like I said, available for free on the internet. And yeah, you'll laugh, and it almost makes addressing the problem sound fun. But not to minimize it, I just want to plug that for a second. But back to
I'd like to turn the conversation back to a couple of speakers who were getting philosophical about others and I'm a philosophical thinker. There is one particular word which has been used in this room several times this last hour or so, which hurts me, and that's the word settler. To me, settler calls up an image from the cowboy movies of a log cabin in the woods and flaming arrows. That's an emotional level that's built into me. I think I understand the kind of thinking which applies that term to a member of the dominant society. And yes, my ancestors have been on this, on Turtle Island, some of them for 180 years, some of them only for 100 years. Anyway, and I'm British and proud of that. British Canadian. But somehow to cast the discussion, the dialogue, in terms of words which carry connotations of open violence, is just not the way to go. It's hurtful to us. Is there not a better word? Yes, I'm a member of the dominant society, the Indigenous society. Maybe we just have to keep tossing around. I've given up the word native in the last year, although I work for the Toronto Native Ministry. Anyway, gone over to Rivershire, I would like to bring back Indian. Anyway, can we not find some words which are less categorizing, less smacking of violent confrontation, words which allow that there's lots of us whose roots are solidly in the European continent, who are also trying to navigate this sort of no man's land. I like the metaphor of trying to paddle 2 canoes at once. It's kind of nice. We're trying to navigate to be true to a heritage which got a lot of good stuff. It has been used for colonial, and a lot of good stuff that's coming from the Indigenous American people. We don't find a more conciliatory language than native versus settler.
So I don't know if everybody in the room heard. Maybe I'll just try to summarize and repeat. So to begin with the book itself uses the terms settler and indigenous in this really polarizing way, as some other people have said. And the speaker mentioned as many times as the term settler is used, you felt offended by it. And is there not a better vocabulary criticizing other terms in their weaknesses too? What is, I guess the question is, what is the best vocabulary for us to use as we talk about the problem. I don't know if Jennifer,
Sure,
you began talking about yourself as a settler.
Yeah, and I thought a lot about this actually. So first I would say that one of the dilemmas in the conversation sometimes is that Indigenous peoples come to the table with a history and we just show up and don't talk about the history. Like we show up kind of ahistorically. The problem is it wasn't a conciliar history. And so what I want to do is to come with my history to the table, because that's being honest about the roots of where I come from. Now, you know, I don't know the actions and the intentions and the mindset of my ancestors. But I can tell you, speaking only for myself, that, you know, if they've been here since the 1600s, they were part of the colonizing project. That project was violent. I know that my ancestors of faith were part of the residential schools process. That process was at least thing you could call it was cultural genocide. So the dilemma is that I do come from that tradition. And I bring that with me into the conversation. Now, can I choose another future? Can I try to make another future? Absolutely. And I think that's very much what, you know, I try to do in my life. But I don't think it helps for me to obscure that historical context that I bring into the conversation. The dilemma is that there is this massive power differential that exists still. And so while I think we have to recognize, and I think it's an important point, the pluralities, it doesn't help us to essentialize Indigenous people as if they have one perspective. That's in fact doing more, and I think it doesn't help on the other side to say there is only one settler perspective, there are many. But there is still a massive power differential, and the voices are still weighted towards one side of the conversation. And so the reality is, in order to address that over time, there has to be some quietness on our side of discussion so that other things can emerge. And so, I mean, I wouldn't tell people how to identify themselves. That's folks' choice. And I understand that there's a harshness. Some people talk about second peoples. For me, it's important to distinguish that I feel like I'm part of the settler community. There are newcomers who are less part of that, but could be called